I'm standing here in the very pleasant square outside Venezuela's National Assembly, where the new law on hydrocarbons has been passed. This consists of a number of amendments to the basic law on hydrocarbons. And there's a great deal of misunderstanding about what this law does and why it's been passed. And a lot of that is due to deliberate misinformation. And I think it's quite important to understand what's happening in Venezuela now, to understand what has been passed and why, and what the genesis of that was. The first and most important fact to grasp is that this law was drafted and developed after a great deal of national consultation under President Maduro. It hasn't been passed as a consequence of his kidnap. And the fact that it was introduced into the National Assembly the day after his kidnap does not mean it was his kidnap which caused it. That process had already been underway for months and simply continued on. This is a consequence of President Maduro's policy. This is part of President Maduro's program. And there's a false narrative being put around, and being put around particularly by Donald Trump and by the CIA and by opposition supporters. And that false narrative states that Maduro was kidnapped and his kidnap enabled this law to happen, and that it's happening against his wishes, and all of that is completely not true. What the new law does is bring Venezuelan legislation and Venezuelan practice in its oil and gas industry into line with the vast majority of oil-producing countries. It moves from a state monopoly of production and distribution of hydrocarbons to a commercial model based on concessions and royalty payments, much like, as I say, the vast majority of countries in the world. And sadly, like the vast majority of countries in the world, particularly developing countries, there's much in this which is, advantageous to multinationals. There's much to complain about in terms of, for example, provisions which take adjudication of disputes between the state of Venezuela and a contracting corporation out of the Venezuelan legal system and into international fora or national fora. But that again is absolutely standard. I mean, that sadly is the world we live in. That's what happens almost everywhere. This in no way is exceptional or unusual, nor is the fact that royalty payments can be varied by the government to between 30%, which is set as the norm, down to 15%, and in exceptional circumstances to 0%. And that is to allow for initial reimbursement of investment by companies. It's to allow for costs of perhaps pollution cleanup that has to be undertaken, other such things. And again, it's not unusual. It's not in any sense unique to Venezuela. Venezuela's legislation is now like standard legislation worldwide. And it's also worth saying that what this does is to encodify and regulate practices which had been coming in, which the Venezuelan government has been bringing in with foreign contractors over the last few years. And Venezuela has seen an increase in oil production in the last 2 years, something which has not been generally noted. Now, to those of us, myself included, who are socialists, it's not great that this has had to happen. And the reason it has had to happen is that the sanctions imposed on Venezuela, both the economic sanctions, the sanctions on delivery of goods, the sanctions on technical support, and the financial sanctions which limited Venezuela's access to its own capital. Those sanctions by the Western government by Western governments, which have been going on for years and years and years. This did not start under Trump. Ever since the Chavez administration came into power, there have been these crippling sanctions on the Venezuelan economy. These sanctions mean that we will never really know how well the socialist model of full governmental control and production in the oil sector would have worked, because it was never given a chance to work. It was crippled by the West, by sanctions. So there's a very real truth in which the Venezuelan government has been forced by the impact of sanctions to shift from a fully socialist model of society to a more social democratic model of society, at least for a while, until things can get kick-started again. And we have to be honest and accept that that is what is happening here. But what the legislation does not do is it does not give up any Venezuelan sovereignty over its oil reserves. Venezuela remains fully sovereign on its oil reserves and free to give concessions and free to take back. The oil still belongs to Venezuela. Venezuela can lease a concession to the oil. That does not mean that Venezuela has lost sovereignty over the oil. The state remains the giver of concessions, and the state has the ability to take back concessions. And under international law, a state has the inalienable right to its mineral resources. That's very important to say. So a lot of things, the critical things that are being said about this legislation are very much exaggerated. There's something else happening, which is entirely illegal, is basically piracy, and which has nothing at all to do with the new legislation that has been passed. And that's very important to understand, because that is being misrepresented quite deliberately, I think, in the West as part of the legislation, whereas it isn't. It isn't in the legislation, and it's not done with the agreement of the government of Venezuela. The US Navy started seizing tankers carrying Venezuelan oil for export, particularly to Russia, to China, and to other places. And the United States instituted a policy of seizing on the high seas, as an act of piracy in effect, Venezuelan oil, unless it was given to just two commercial companies, one being Vitol, the other being Trafigura. Now, that was implemented by the overwhelming force of the US Navy. It was not done with the agreement or the cooperation of the Venezuelan government. Unfortunately, the Venezuelan government simply had no physical or military ability to stop it. And under that arrangement, Vitol and Trafigura lifted oil from Venezuela, which payment was given for to a United States entity, not even to the US Treasury, to an entity based in Qatar under the personal control of Donald Trump. And money from that entity, some money at the discretion of Trump, was then given to the Venezuelan government. That is how the United States physically captured, by the use of naval power, control of Venezuela's oil resources. This is completely illegal, and none of that whatsoever is in the legislation. It has nothing to do with the legislation passed by the Venezuelan parliament. It is actually modelled on what the Americans did to Iraq. When the Americans invaded with their British and other allies, when they invaded and destroyed Iraq, they seized physical control of Iraq's oil. They controlled the sales, and all the money for Iraq's oil was paid into the US Treasury, and then some of it given back to the government of Iraq. So Trump hasn't invented this. He's following the model that Bush instituted in Iraq, and which was maintained by Obama and others since. But there's a difference in what Bush is doing, because at least the money from Iraq went into the US Treasury. This is not going into the US Treasury. The money from Venezuelan oil has been given to this fund controlled by Trump without any congressional or legislative control at all in the United States. So it provides Bush with a massive slush fund which he can use to conduct policy and finance operations out with the control of the US Congress. So not only is it a tremendous breach of international law, it's a tremendous threat to the constitutional order of the United States of America. And finally, I want to come on to the last point in this, which is the subject of severe misrepresentation. And that is Donald Trump's claims that he is controlling Venezuela and he is controlling the Venezuelan president, Delcy Rodriguez. This is simply untrue. And it's a narrative which Trump and the CIA and certain opposition figures in Miami have been very, very keen to push. Because Trump hasn't actually changed anything much in Venezuela. All he's managed to do is, using the Navy, seize physical control of Venezuelan oil in a blatantly illegal act. But the policies passed through this parliament was being developed long before Trump's, not only long before the kidnap of Maduro, long before the institution of Trump's naval embargo on Venezuela. So Trump hasn't controlled Venezuela. He has not abrogated Venezuelan sovereignty on a permanent basis. He is not controlling the president, but he is making these claims in order to claim victory. He is trying to build a narrative of triumphalism because actually he failed. He assembled a huge armada of Venezuela. He didn't actually do anything with it except murder 100-odd people, and we shouldn't forget the dozen fishermen, innocent fishermen he murdered under excuse of narcotics interdiction, and the kidnapping of President Maduro and his wife, which is a breach of so many international laws. It's the initiation of an illegal war of aggression. It's a breach of the principle of sovereign immunity. It's just illegal in every possible way. But what has it actually achieved? Very little. So the narrative that Delcy Rodriguez is Donald Trump's puppet, totally untrue narrative, is being propounded in order to make him seem like the winner and him seem like a great success. Whereas in fact, for the enormous amount of money he expended, he has achieved very little, and what he has achieved is counterproductive, both for Venezuela, for the United States, and for the world. I hope that helps explain what's happening.